So we're here to talk with Dr. Clifton Sherrill, colleague of mine for Troy University, who wrote a book on Iran. So he literally wrote a book. A lot of people wrote books, but Cliff has written the book and he has been watching the Iran protests. And so we're going to talk about those. So Cliff, thanks for joining me. And what is the origin? Let's just bring people up to date with the origin and where these protests are right now.
So the protest kicked off back in mid-September, revolving around the death of a young woman, a Kurdish Iranian woman, Mahsa Jina Amini. She had been arrested for improper wearing of the hijab. So she wasn't dressed properly. And the morality police took her in and she died in custody. They claim, the Iranian regime claims, that this was due to some underlying pre-existing medical condition. Her family believes that she was beaten to death for nothing more than having some hair showing. And this kicked off the outrage across Iran, kicked off protests first in the Kurdish region, and then they quickly spread across the country. And when the Iranian authorities basically ignored the protests, I think they mushroomed into being an expression of something much more than just outrage at this one incident, but they became a vehicle for expressing outrage at the entire Islamic regime, economic, political, social, gender discrimination, about everything. It's just the people are sick and tired of the current regime. So that's the origins of the protests, but I think they've mushroomed into something much, much larger.
So this is is this a threat to the regime, do you think?
I do. I think this is clearly become, after 3 months now, or approaching 3 months, the most sustained, the longest and broadest in scope set of demonstrations or protests that the Islamic regime has ever faced since its founding in 1979. So we've seen protests over the past 13 or 14 years. The first real protests of any size were back around 99, 2000, and they were squashed. And then the next major protests that we saw were in 2009, the Green Revolution, with the electoral shenanigans with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's second election. And they were squashed, but they were much larger, I think, in 2009. And then over the past 13 years, we've seen isolated a couple of weeks or a week here or there, or 3 weeks maybe, over different things, over economics primarily, but also over some social problems. 2017, 2018, we saw some of these, but we haven't seen anything as sustained across the entire country, and where the protesters are not just saying, one particular grievance or striking based on wages only, where we've seen the protesters calling for the overthrow of the regime and death to the supreme leader. Things that 15 years ago were unthinkable that we would have seen. Now we're seeing that. So I think it very much is a real threat to the existence of the regime. And I think this is consistent with the argument I put in my book, Losing Legitimacy. So that came out 4 years ago. And I argued therein that the regime was losing popular legitimacy because of its failures politically, economically, socially. And I think what we've seen now is the what I consider the murder of Mahsa Amini has really kick-started or been the tinder for this explosion of outrage, really evidencing the complete loss of legitimacy for the regime at this point.
So I'm glad you mentioned your book, because I was thinking that it was very relevant. But okay, so do you see, what similarities do you see between this movement and the original Islamic revolution.
Right. And I think that's a great point, because in 1979, the people were fed up with an autocratic regime, rife with corruption, accepted no political dissent, a totally unaccountable government. And the people had just grown fed up, tired of this over the years of the Shah's increasingly corrupt and autocratic government. And that was the birth of the Islamic regime. You had Ayatollah Khomeini able to create this coalition of not just Islamists, but Democrats, secularists, even Marxists in the original coalition, to overthrow the Shah based on popular antipathy towards the Shah's regime. Now, in the next 3 or 4 years, Khomeini eliminated all of the undesirable elements of that coalition, and the Islamists were able to take complete control of the regime. But I think today we see very similar idea: an autocratic regime, a personalist leader, no accountability in government, abusive security and intelligence apparatus, economic failures, the corruption and the inequalities in the not only political but economic inequalities in the state. And I think the people are again outraged, and those that are old enough to remember the Islamic Revolution say this is what we were fighting against 43 years ago. But I think it's a new generation that doesn't have that experience of the Shah's government that is saying this is not how we wish to live. This is not 21st century life.
And so, how is what is the regime doing? What are they attempting to do to quell this?
Yeah, so the regime so far has responded, as one might expect, with brutality. I believe so far the estimates are somewhere around 460 people have been killed in the protests, some 18,000 plus arrested and detained. And at the time of this recording, just yesterday, we had the first execution of one of the protesters for the crime of crimes against God, right? This ambiguous, it is whatever the state says it is, crime held not in regular courts, but in the revolutionary courts, where there isn't legal counsel, evidence is not presented even to the defendant. And essentially the court acts as both prosecutor and judge. It's a sham, a complete sham of justice. And we have several other individuals that have already been sentenced to death, and there will probably be a lot more. So it's come down very hard on this. Interestingly, though, in the past couple of weeks, we've seen some indication of that perhaps the regime is not unified. We had officials making some vague, some ambiguous comments about shutting down the morality police and revisiting the hijab laws. And the Western media ran with this and said, Iran is shutting down the morality police. But I think if you go look at what's actually in the state media from Iran, and Iran, by the way, via the Constitution, the state has a monopoly over broadcast media, and it clearly controls and censors print media. But if you look at what the state media says, they have not said that the morality police are being abolished, and they have not said that the hijab laws are changing. And I've been looking through the various media outlets, Tasneem and Fars, and some of the other English language outlets that the regime, has outward facing to the West. And these are not saying that the morality police have been abolished. So I think what we have is maybe somebody got out ahead of themselves that shouldn't have. The supreme leader yesterday or 2 days ago gave a speech in which he said we need to renew the foundations of the Islamist culture. And very clearly, he is not going to be somebody that's going to be willing to make compromises. And this ties back in, I think, to the point about the Shah's regime. One of the real issues that led to the Shah's downfall was his vacillation, was his perceived weakness, in that he would crack down one week and then 2 weeks later say, we're going to give in to some of the demands, we're going to make reforms. And then he'd crack down again and there'd be violence. And there was this inconsistency that just led to further outrage. It made the Shah look weak. It made him look like he had no idea what he was doing. I think the Islamist regime has learned from that. And so I don't think that we're going to see concessions made. I think that in their minds that they have to portray strength, and that is through physical violence for this regime, no concessions, no giving in to reformists. So I'll be surprised if we actually see those types of concessions emerge.
One question I have, though, is a lot of, the Shah, Ferdinand Marcos in Egypt recently, the leader there, these are people who got sick. And, it's a big part of selectorate theory and all of that, that when you have an entrenched leader and they have when you start perceiving the end of the regime or that there will be a turnover, things get wonky. So how is that the actual health of the supreme leader nowadays?
Yeah, and that we don't know because there have been reports for, frankly, about 15 years now. We get different reports that, the supreme leader is gravely ill. Just this September, there were widespread reports in the Western media that he was on his deathbed. Clearly, he was not. Ayatollah Khomeini is in his early to mid 80s now. We do have information with some confidence that he does have prostate health issues or has in the past. And of course, Khomeini experienced lifelong injuries and limited use of his right arm from an attack in 1980. So I don't want to portray him as being the picture of great health. But I think that from the appearances in the media, he seems to be in relatively good health. I don't have any reason to believe that he has some underlying, for example, the Shah had cancer, as you point out, some underlying disease like this. I think that the succession of Khomeini is going to come in the near future, but I think that's based simply on old age rather than health. I'd note also Khomeini has not, and I think this is consistent with a lot of authoritarian leaders, Khomeini has not created an heir apparent. He has not designated a particular successor. And in the Iranian regime, there is factionalization. We can't say, this is a lockstep Stalinist regime. It's not. There is factionalization within this regime. There's different parties or different, not political parties, but different points of view within the regime. So I don't think that he wants to name a particular successor for fear that that would then alienate the factions that are not named, right? So this is going to be a very interesting time when Khomeini does leave the scene. The Constitution has a mechanism for succession, but it's never actually been tested. Khomeini was essentially handpicked by Khomeini, which is not the way the Constitution is supposed to work. And that's the only succession that we've had. So this is going to be a very dicey time for the regime.
All right. Well, thank you for your comments here. It's interesting, and it's interesting. We have a lot of interesting things going on in the world, and I just always think of that Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Cliff Sherrill. Always great to have you on.